My name is Antonio Lopez. I'm 26 years old. I'm bringing an experience as someone who's incredibly invested in the community. I'm a graduate of Duke University, magna cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa. I've gone on to Oxford on a Marshall Scholarship, one of the most prestigious scholarships in the United States. And now I'm back from Oxford to Stanford studying a PhD. So I'm someone who heavily believes in education. When we think about uplifting our community, it starts from the bottom. That's why this campaign is heavily about investing in our youth. Child of Mexican immigrants, and really passionate about bringing everyone to the table, particularly our youth and our seniors.
How much affordable housing do you think should reside in East Palo Alto? Do you have like a specific percentage number of how much affordable housing there should be in the city?
As much as possible. I know we have a 20% housing ordinance, but we are really in unprecedented times. I cannot stress more the fact that we are poised to witness some of the worst displacement the city has seen by low-income minority tenants. So I'm running on comprehensive rent forgiveness, right? Because we need nothing short of federal and state aid, and the philanthropy and donations we've gotten is just simply not enough from an economic sense, not even a moral sense. Mm-hmm. And so as much as possible, and making sure that folks who've lived here can afford to stay here.
Mm-hmm. What about market rate housing? Is that on your list of priorities at all?
I think there should be a certain amount, especially as we're seeing the demography of East Palo Alto shift. We have new folks, more affluent folks coming in, right? So certainly having housing that caters to every part of our community is important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but how would you make sure, there's current residents, maybe perhaps low income renter who might think, oh, you're going to bring in all these new people. How do you sort of lay that concern?
I mean, that feeds into the tensions we have in the community, right? Whether you're talking about Black and Latino folks, or the issues between low income and high income folks, right? This is a small city, incredibly dense, 2.5 square miles, and you have 30,000 people. You're going to have tensions by virtue of the space. But I think it starts with creating spaces for making conversations of, whether you're a tenant, whether you've just been here for 10 years, or someone trying to buy market rate, right? Getting to know each other and building infrastructure and spaces where we can get to know each other is going to be really crucial moving forward about how we're going to make sure CPA stays harmonious in terms of race and class.
Do you have a sense of what the right type of commercial development is, or perhaps I should ask how much commercial development your city should bring in?
Well, I think it starts with a conversation as early as possible with our developers. I've had the pleasure of meeting a few, and certainly many of them are equity minded. They care about keeping the community preserved, not displacing folks. So I think it goes back to not just letting the developers know on their end what's going on, but also our tenants what's going on, and making sure that whether it's, I know they've done surveys in the past, but making sure that we can create physical on-site meetings, social distance as possible, so that those developers can meet community members and they can be able to express their issues, their comments, right? Because I have an idea as a councilman, but I also think it's important that we empower and enfranchise those folks who are the 9-to-5ers, the working class folks, to find half an hour to express their grievances, and the developers hear directly from them when they're shaping how the city is going to look like.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned equity. What is equitable commercial development?
Well, equitable commercial development has to understand that you're moving into a community that is heavily working class, that has been incorporated only for the past 30 years. It's understanding that East Palo Alto in the South Peninsula is a very unique city in a very unique location. And equity, I think we have to have developers and commercial developers who have a really rich understanding of this community, what this community needs, and not being able to apply one such all solution, especially when we think about the 14 development projects in the pipeline, right? Each location, given its street, how many people live there, whether, what was there before, right? Being really deliberate and conscious about what the community wants. I think, to me, that's equity. It's when developers not dictate what they want, but that they're learning that the community are co-partners in that effort, and making sure we develop initiatives so that people can have those feedbacks, have that voice, have that transparency.
What role do you think tech companies should play in the future of this city? For example, do you think the city should provide more financial support to the city's infrastructure? Or what do you think the tech companies should be doing when they come into East Palo Alto?
I think, yeah, sure. I think one right off the bat is really enhancing our Wi-Fi, right? When we're thinking about COVID and how everything is going off remote and digital, we have to make sure we digitize as much as possible. And right now we're having a lot of areas in East kids don't have Wi-Fi, where we can't go to school, where they aren't able to learn, right? And so tech companies being in that industry should really uplift our infrastructure, electronically speaking. So I want to make sure every tech service or tech company moving in, that they're investing in creating more fiber optic cables right under our city, right? To make sure that whichever part of the city you're in, you have Wi-Fi, right? These are services that Palo Alto has, the Menlo Park has. There is no reason East Palo Alto should not have the same thing. And similar to air and water, Wi-Fi in the age of 2020 should also be a right that East Palo Alto residents should have. So that should be something they should do.
Would you be open to the idea of bringing in more tech companies then? In that case, if a tech company considers that, would you be like, hey, you're welcome to develop in this city, make more offices if you'd like?
Yeah, absolutely. But again, I think there has to be very upfront regulations and policies and requests. For example, when Sobrado came in, they didn't honor the first local source hiring, and I think that was a mistake on the council's end. I think we need to make sure that we're more insistent that when the community wants to be hired there, they can afford to, that they can. And if Amazon, for instance, if they're saying, well, there isn't any Black or brown workers who have those credentials, then they invest to creating that from the ground up, right? So we need to make sure we have council members that advocate that when we hit a firewall, that we still insist, then let's try to invest in this community, and not just when plan A doesn't work, we kind of throw our hands up in the air and say, hey, we tried.
What plan do you have to create more jobs in East Palo Alto? You mentioned how the first source hiring was didn't work out as well as it did. Do you have a plan to create more jobs for East Palo Alto residents?
When we're thinking about, again, the kind of business we're bringing in, and we have the Ravenswood Business District, right? I'm advocating for first floor leasing. So when we have those offices upstairs, we have a commercial, almost like a kind of casino style, where the entrepreneurs, because we have a city that people on Facebook neighbors, they post, they have Bubba, or Bubba, tea, or they have pizza, or they have hot links, or they have taquerias, right? This community has tremendous ambition. It just needs the opportunity. So for me, it's making sure that we have folks that look like us, talk like us, walk like us in those buildings, particularly if we're entrepreneurs, right? Capacitating our youth, especially, right? I'm working with youth staffers who have a clothing line, right? We should get them to also advertise that clothing line, right? Really telling our community, as much money is being pumped into these buildings, you're also going to be a part of that, and making sure we can put them in those offices downstairs, wherever that may be, and to make them, again, partners in this new transformation of East Palo Alto.
Do you have plans to mitigate the impact of the pandemic, especially when it talks about like economic impact?
Sure. I mean, masks. We just need to pump out more masks as a community, as a council, right? In the same way that we have food dispensaries all across the city, we should also have food banks, I believe, because in Spanish is dispensa, so the translation, sorry. When we have food banks all across this community, which are wonderful, I think that's awesome. We need to add a station where people can have hand sanitizers and masks, and we pass out literature and say, these are the ways. For example, basic information. In outdoors, COVID is a lot less likely to be contracted. Indoors, it's extremely unsafe. We also need to have, there has been an absence of Spanish language information, right? We need to make sure that we reach out to the 70% Latino residents, right? Which, granted, not all of them just speak Spanish, but to those middle-aged folks like my parents or the elderly, we're also speaking their language about how they can stay safe. I think also it's important that the city council members put public service announcements, right? Nothing beats meeting someone or your council member and your leader telling you over camera or face-to-face if possible, right? Distance, to say, hey, these are the issues, this is what's happening, and here's how you can protect your family. That's why my campaign, we go that mile, and we're giving out masks and sanitizers to each resident, right? To say you matter, you care, and we're committed to see you staying safe. I think if we can do it as a candidate, 26 years old, I think our council members should also step up and make that happen.
And you've been pretty vocal about this, but you've mentioned about this sort of tidal wave that's coming with low-income renters who are racking up debt, unable to pay back their rent. I'm sure you know that the city's eviction moratorium ended last week on September 30th. How do you plan to address that issue then? Should the city provide financial aid?
Look, Lloyd, realistically speaking, the amount of money we need is just not enough through philanthropic efforts. If Facebook donates $1 million, that's that's admirable, but it's just not enough. And frankly, when we think about the dignity of this community, waiting for our wealthy tech companies to give us money, to me, isn't something I'm going to rest. That's not the hill. That's, to me, that's insufficient. What I'm advocating for is comprehensive rent forgiveness. We need nothing short of federal and state aid to come in to save this community. We do not have enough money as a council. We're restricted and circumscribed by Governor Newsom's, law. So we have limited options, but that does not mean we can't be ambitious and broad, because this community, to preserve it, I am telling you, Lloyd, needs nothing short of that, right? So I am calling for a very progressive idea, rent forgiveness. But at the same time, President Joe Biden in Good Morning America in May also advocated for rent forgiveness. So this is something that is not radical. This is something that is not impossible. It just takes the leadership to really step in and say, hey, we should explore all possibilities. And if we haven't turned this rock, then this community deserves that. We need to look into it.
What about East Palo Alto seniors? Many of them are homebound because of the risk of COVID-19. Do you have any plans to increase resources or bolster current resources like the
Sure.
East Palo Alto Senior Citizen Center? Or...
Sure. So one of the things that I'm calling for is a program called the City Ambassadors Program, where we get 20 to 40 youth and we have them basically be hotline specialists, where if they're busy, they can call this hotline and a couple staffs will be available to call them, right? So when a senior has trouble accessing the internet or accessing the web, which when we think about older generations, digital illiteracy is an issue, they can call a youth person, a young person, and they can get that. And what that does, Lloyd, is there's two things. One, it allows the senior to access those services, right? To get someone on the call, to create that trust again in their city. But two, it also fosters important relationships between our seniors and our youth, which, as I said in the beginning, are two of the disaffected generations of this community. I want to see more coalitions across races, but also across generations, right? To pass on that knowledge, to learn from our older elders, and to make them feel that they still have a seat on the table, that their input matters. And so we need to make sure we create those inroads.
What about beyond COVID-19? What do you think can be done more to support EPA seniors?
I think when we think about our seniors affected on a fixed income, when we think about the affordable housing that's in development, right, making sure that we allot a certain amount of that for our seniors, I think that's extremely important, right? Because these are folks who aren't going to have more money coming in per se. We need to be very mindful that when we have when we have those waiting lists and we have those people waiting for those houses, we think of our seniors first and foremost as well, to make sure that they can stay in those areas. Again, just showing that we're invested, that they matter. They're also an equal partner on the table.
In the wake of George Floyd's death, Breonna Taylor, there's obviously a national spotlight on police departments. I'm wondering, what do you think East Palo Alto's police department's role in the community down the road?
Yeah, there's certainly, one of the issues is that we've had a historically understaffed police force, right? We only have 4 officers on staff. Many community members have expressed issues of when they call, they might not show up, or the issue doesn't get resolved. And so I think something that we have to think about in the era of George Floyd is, of course, police reform. One thing that I would advocate for is when an officer comes to your doorstep, there is a psychologist or a psychiatrist, a trained professional who is there to de-escalate the situation. Because as both of us know, not every situation calls for a gun. And when we think about how tight-knit this community is, we have the fortune and the opportunity to be able to enforce community policing, right? Our police officers working with our neighborhood leaders, our neighbors, folks who are already doing the work of leading the city to create those let's make those relationships official and have linkages with them. So that way, when an officer goes to a given neighborhood, they know who to talk to and get an in-depth look of what happened, right? I think community policing and having trained psychologists is going to be essential moving forward to East Palo Alto, especially considering that with the resources we have, we're not going to have more police. And frankly, that may not be something that folks want.
There's a lot of people who might say East Palo Alto's police department, it's not the same as, police departments out in the communities. Some might say that it's they have a special relationship, one more positive relationship. I'm kind of wondering where you stand on that. Do you think that's true?
Depends who you ask, because I think, I had a gentleman, there was a gentleman who lived in the village a couple, about half a mile where I'm at. And he was saying there was a police officer who asked him, hey man, there's, they asked, basically the police officer asked him for his gun. Like, are you selling the gun? And that remark really off-put the resident. He's a longtime resident here. And so I think it's those kinds of interactions where there is a remark or a statement or something off that the officer said that's gonna sour relationships with the community. On the other hand, you do have positive relationships where the officer comes in, but I do think, to answer your question, there is an issue of mistrust or frustration that they're not getting the job done, that they're coming in late, that they're not fixing the issue. And so I think, again, fostering more communal relationships with our city, with our neighborhood leaders, to make sure that the needs of the community are met is going to be really important moving forward.
One resident wants to know, do you have a plan to address the lack of sidewalks and lampposts in many parts of the city streets?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, safer streets has been one of our pillars of this campaign. And again, this is an relatively under-resourced city. We don't have as much money as folks think. And when I spoke to the director of public works, Kamal, you have to understand, much of our money in terms of infrastructure comes from state and federal grants. And so making sure that we can capacitate our engineers, our grant writers in East Palo Alto, to make sure we get that swiftly and quickly for our community is going to be essential. There's a current study done by Hexagon this past year that's looking deeply into and surveying what are the possible solutions for, improving our neighborhoods, right? Whether it's, parking permits or one-way streets or speed bumps, right? Speed bumps has been a huge issue of the community. I'm going to advocate for that moving forward. But to answer your issue about improving sidewalks, that's going to be something where we're going to have to get grants for that. And I'm someone who's certainly going to make sure that our engineers and our staff can move forward with that as quickly as possible. And what can we do as a city to help accelerate that?
Mm-hmm. Stuart actually mentioned an interesting point, because when I asked that question, he mentioned how, that also goes in line with the parking issue, because many people use these, you can call these non-sidewalks as parking spaces. So I'm wondering, how do you sort of balance between that, if you want to create sidewalks, but you might be getting rid of parking spaces?
Lord, you have to understand, as I'm sure you know, the problems in East Palo Alto are like a balloon, right? If you try to fix the affordable housing part, you're going to have the parking issue. If you try to fix the parking issue, you're going to have the fact that, well, people are overcrowded, and they're going to have to find a place to park anyways. And so you have to really think dynamically and intersectionally when you're thinking about how to fix those issues. So to answer your question, which is about sidewalks, correct? What was it?
Mm-hmm. Sidewalks, yeah.
Yeah.
And parking.
And parking, yeah. Well, there's a couple of solutions on the table. One aspect that I always say to people is that there's 49 churches in East Palo Alto, believe it or not, 49 churches, right? Many of them are inactive or haven't run service in quite a while. What I want to do as a city is partner up with those churches so we can see if we can use their empty lots, because these cars will not go anywhere. Some of them will if we install parking permits, for instance, because some cars are coming from Menlo Park and Palo Alto. That's true, particularly in the Menlo Park border. We can help reduce that number, but there's still quite a amount of surplus of cars by virtue of the fact that we're overcrowded and 12% of our residents have 4 or more cars, right? So how do we transfer those cars into another part of the city without drastically changing without making it much more difficult for our folks to get to work, to do their daily activities, right? I want to partner up with churches to make sure we can use their lots, and again, decongest our streets just a bit.
Mm-hmm. What about the city's water system infrastructure? This kind of has been on the agenda for quite some time and still kind of remains an issue. We have an old water system infrastructure. Do you have an idea of how it should be improved, who should pay for it, and how it should be financed?
Yeah, as I said earlier, when I spoke to the public works Kamal on this point, part of the issue is that we just need more water to be pumped, and we're actually borrowing water from other cities like Palo Alto and Menlo Park. I think making sure that we maintain those relationships to make sure that we have that transparency, have that cordial, have those partnerships where that we can use their water, but also, again, when we're thinking about what grants we're prioritizing, making sure that we're updating our pipes. That's something that, especially as EPA is expanding, that should be first or second priority, in my opinion.
When you consider all these developments, how do you plan to address the traffic congestion?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, when we think about the Dumbarton Rail project, when we think about, we need to get a train station here in East Palo Alto, right? That is something that any major city deserves, any major city needs. We've had that sort of in the books of the Dumbarton Rail. We need to have a stop in East Palo Alto, right? So commuters can come in from the East Bay, and people coming in and not necessarily having to park here. We have to utilize trains as any other city like Menlo Park does, like Palo Alto does, right? We just need to make EPA more dynamic, uplift it, And to me, having that infrastructure where folks can come in but not necessarily have to park here is going to be extremely essential, as we're going to have dozens upon dozens, we're going to have dozens of development projects.
You've sort of pitched yourself as a representative for EPA's youth community. You're a younger candidate, obviously. What sort of resources do you think the city needs to invest in for East Palo Alto kids? Like, I'm wondering what you think is missing.
Well, as I said, again, I think, first of all, just having leadership in the council is going to be essential, right? When you think about who is representing you and you're thinking about what a democracy is making sure that your voice is represented on the table. So having someone who is a millennial, who understands what that means, which is you're coming home from East Palo Alto, you're college educated, but you don't know where to live, right? Because you can't afford it. Making sure that someone in the council can help represent you, but also, again, having internships and programs that the city can sponsor, that you can put on your resume. Again, making them part of the transformation of East Palo Alto and creating programs that really put them in that pipeline is going to be so essential moving forward, because frankly, they're going to be the next leaders of East Palo Alto. So the earlier we can do to capacitate them to that platform and that position, the better we're going to be as a city.
Some residents have expressed concerns about access to healthy food alternatives and organic produce. Some might describe EPA as a food swamp. Do you have a plan to ensure that residents, who might not be able to afford groceries at Trader Joe's or Whole Foods would have access to fresh produce or healthy food alternatives?
We need a community garden. We need to have several community gardens, quite frankly. We have some vacant lots and empty spaces still. There is one by the bay. There's one at the end of O'Connor, right? When I was helping we had a cleanup event yesterday, a couple weeks ago. And in that lot area by the Baylands Trail, there's just a patch of grass, right? And that is a perfect site for community gardens. What community gardens will do, Lloyd, is they'll bring community folks together, create those social bonds that are so essential, black, white, everyone needs vegetables. They can help maintain it. We can get high school kids to come and help use that as a field trip experience, right? This can be a place for public health courses and sessions, right? When I think about how to keep healthy foods, right, and let's just grow them. We have the land, we have the soil. Let's invest in our community. Let's invest in our health. We can make it happen, and let's partner up with with our developers to make sure that happens.
Do you have a plan to sort of better prepare the city's residents as things like wildfires become a more frequent reality?
We talk about the air, we talk about the digital divide, but we're not talking about the air purifier or the AC divide. We need this city to invest in air purifiers, to install them as many homes as possible. When we think about, it's not if, it's when. Climate change is imminent, it is happening, it is a fact. So when we're thinking about city leadership, we need someone who's proactive, who is thinking about the next wave of fires and how are we going to install these purifiers to make sure that our community is safe. And again, whether it's working with nonprofits, whether that's working with Purple Air, getting the partners on the table to invest in our community and make sure our folks can breathe here.
People sort of stand on different spectrums of this issue. Some feel the need to pour more resources into homelessness. Others kind of see them as almost a health concern. There's some who express that, I find feces in front of my doorsteps, and they attribute to homeless people. We can't say for sure, but I'm kind of curious, where do you stand in terms of how homelessness should be addressed in East Palo Alto?
I think we as a city should remember that we were in rough circumstances, right? 1992 had the worst murder capital rate in the United States, right? We had drugs coming into our streets. When we think about this community and personified, we also were in really tough circumstances. So we need to be more empathetic, more understanding. We don't know what that person has gone through. And I think as a city, right, I'm very glad to see Project We Hope and Pastor Baines putting more initiative in this regard, right? We have a couple of bathroom stations so they can wash, right? We've been on the front lines for that. I think that should also be expanded, having more wash stations. I also think we should hire a homeless population, right? In Palo Alto, we have Downtown Streets Team or Clean Streets, right? I forget the name of it exactly, but this organization hires homeless folks, has them beautify our streets, and then employers or neighboring employers can say, hey, we want to hire that person. We like their hustle, right? So capacitating our homeless people to be a part of our city, to them, again, as I said, many people lack the opportunity. And in this regard, is no different. Making sure we partner up with a nonprofit to set up a kind of program where they can showcase their talents, and making sure that homelessness isn't permanent, it's only temporary. That to me is a priority as councilman. Absolutely, wholeheartedly.
What would you say in response to there's a Silicon Valley Taxpayers Association saying that this measure is they kind of attribute it as grifters taking away money from something they don't even deserve. What would your response be to that?
When Four Seasons moved into East Palo Alto, again, it goes back to the development question. It has to understand the environment it is in. It is in an environment that is rapidly changing, that is being gentrified. And so when we think about equity-minded partners, we need folks in hotels specifically who understand that they're dealing with a community that is, low-income working class, and how can they pay their fair share, right? That is what we ask for developers up front. I'm not lying behind that. That is our policy. And so I think this notion of grifters is insulting, because what we're asking isn't a luxury. It's a request to say, hey, as people who are paying to stay here, right? You're staying in the Four Seasons, you can afford a modest 2% tax increase. We're not mooching, we're not leeching. This is something that this community to stay afloat deserves, and we're asking you to contribute to that future we want to see, where everyone can afford to live here.
So one of the reasons incumbents have said it's important for them to stay on the council is because they're familiar with how city council works. They're familiar with the developments they're pursued and are currently pursuing. So I'm wondering, why do you think the city should vote for you come November? What's missing in the city council right now that you need to fill in?
When we think about the fact that COVID has 1,100 plus positive rate, when we think about the fact that the census, we're still scrambling to get that done, right? It doesn't matter how many decades of experience we had in the world. These are unprecedented circumstances. COVID cannot be predicted. And we need someone in that leadership who has energy, who is proactive. Yes, I don't have the experience. But when we think about the importance of having youth in our council and having that next generation have a voice, that is essential to any democracy. And again, I applaud the work of the incumbents, and I think it's important. But I also think it's important to have that perspective of the next generation who's coming in line to say, hey, I'm also part of this city. I also want to afford to live here. And someone who has that direct experience, that direct perspective is super important moving forward. We need people who innovate. We need people who are creative. And I think this generation and the sheer hustle and has the most entrepreneurs in the generation. And when we have people who are struggling to make it here, no other generation understands that more than millennials. That is why we need someone who's of this age, of my age, in that table to help pass. We need to pass down that knowledge, pass down the baton. And COVID has taught us the status quo is not sustainable. We need innovative solutions, and that's why we need young folks in that council as well.